She thought escaping Fred's shadow meant she was finally free, but the man sharing her row on the L train was a predator of a different caliber. And unlike her husband, Oscar Buccho didn't need to scream to be heard. He didn't need to move to be felt. His silence was the loudest thing in Chicago. For 5 years, Fred M. Keene hammered one truth into Amanda's mind, that without him, she didn't exist. An orphan with no roots. A ghost with no shadow. A woman the world had already forgotten to look for. And for 5 years, she lived like a prisoner of that lie. Until the night she stopped running and started fleeing. The Chicago L train screeched through the iron veins of the city, the car swaying violently as Amanda sat paralyzed, her white knuckles fused to the handle of her brown handbag. The window reflection told the story of her marriage in a single glance. Shadowed. Lacerated. Fading. A dark purple bloom had claimed her left eye, while jagged cuts from Fred's ring marked her forehead like a brand of ownership. She pulled her pink sweater tighter, trying to fold into herself, trying to become the nothing Fred said she was. The other passengers were a blur of indifference. Some flicked their eyes toward her injuries and quickly looked away. Others stared with a hollow pity that offered no hand to hold. In a city of millions, she was exactly what Fred promised, invisible. Her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as the train decelerated for the next stop. Every screech of the brakes felt like a closing trap. Every shadow at the glass felt like Fred's rugged frame bursting through the doors. Then, the atmosphere in the car didn't just change, it died. The air grew heavy with the scent of expensive cedar and cold, pressurized steel. A silence so absolute it drowned out the rattling tracks. Amanda felt the hair on her arms rise as she realized the hypervigilance that kept her alive was screaming a new warning. Slowly, she turned her head, and realized the most dangerous man in Chicago wasn't the one hunting her down. It was the one sitting inches away, watching her with eyes as cold as the city skyline. The pink wool of her sweater felt less like clothing and more like a shroud. Amanda pulled the sleeves down over her wrists, trying to hide the yellowing finger marks that Fred had left there 3 days ago, or was it 4? In the 5 years since she had said, "I do," time had ceased to be a linear progression of days and had instead become a jagged map of outbursts and apologies. Fred M. Keene was a master of the orphan complex. He hadn't just bruised her body, he had systematically dismantled her history. Every time she reached for a memory of her parents, Fred was there to remind her that they were gone, and that the world had moved on without a second thought. "You're a ghost, Amanda," he would hiss, his rugged face inches from hers, smelling of stale beer and unearned confidence. "If you left this house, you'd just dissipate. No one is looking for a girl with no last name." He had built a psychological cage out of her isolation, using her lack of family as the bars. He made her believe that her petite frame and curly hair were not features, but vulnerabilities that only he could protect, even as he was the one she needed protection from. For half a decade, she had worn this pink sweater like a suit of armor, a soft, fraying shield against a man who equated love with ownership. She had become an expert in the art of disappearing while standing right in front of him, lowering her gaze and softening her voice until she was nothing more than a whisper in her own home. But tonight, the whisper had finally found a scream. As the train surged forward, the rhythm of the track seemed to chant the words she had finally dared to think, "I am not a ghost." Yet, as she sat in the oppressive silence of the man in the navy suit, the old fears clawed at her throat. Fred's voice still echoed in her ear, promising that the world outside his door was a cold, empty vacuum. She looked at her reflection, seeing the nothing Fred had created, and wondered if she had simply traded one cage for a city that didn't care if she lived or died. The L train slowed with a tortured screech of metal, pulling into a station that felt too quiet, too dark, and far too empty. As the pneumatic doors hissed open, the cold Chicago night air rushed in, but it wasn't the wind that made Amanda freeze. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of work boots on the concrete platform. Then, he appeared. Fred moved like a storm front, his rugged frame filling the doorway, his brown jacket stained with rain and sweat. His face was a mask of jagged, unstable fury. He didn't look at the other passengers, he didn't see the city. He saw only his property. "Get off the train, Amanda," he roared, his voice bouncing off the tiled walls of the station like a physical blow. He stepped into the car, his presence chaotic and loud, shattering the fragile sanctuary she had tried to build in her seat. "You think you can just run? You think anyone out here gives a damn about a ghost like you?" Amanda's breath hitched, her fingers digging into the brown leather of her handbag. The orphan complex flared in her chest, a cold reminder that no one would step in, that the world was built to look away from women like her. She began to stand, her knees shaking, the pink wool of her sweater trembling as she prepared to surrender to the only world she knew. But the shift in the air wasn't just cold, it was lethal. Beside her, the man in the navy suit moved. It wasn't a hurried motion, but a calculated unfolding of power. Oscar Buccho rose from the bench, his athletic frame stretching upward until he stood like a pillar of iron between Amanda and the man who sought to break her. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply occupied the space with an authority so absolute it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the car. Fred skidded to a halt, his bravado hitting a wall of silent, well-groomed steel. Oscar adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, his luxury watch catching the flickering overhead light, his expression remaining as unreadable as a grave. He didn't look back at Amanda, he kept his eyes fixed on Fred, a predator recognizing a scavenger. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat Fred had ever uttered. For the first time in 5 years, the loud man wasn't the most dangerous thing in the room. The train car became a vacuum, the flickering fluorescent lights casting jagged shadows over Fred's bewildered face. He looked at Oscar, a man who appeared to be made of expensive fabric and lethal intent, and then back at Amanda, his brain struggling to reconcile her perceived worthlessness with the titan now shielding her. "Move, pal," Fred growled, though the volume of his voice lacked its usual bone-shaking conviction. He tried to puff out his chest, the rugged leather of his jacket creaking. "This is family business. You don't know who she is. She's nothing. She's my wife." Oscar didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply stood there, a masterpiece of Italian tailoring and cold-blooded composure. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Amanda's bones. "I have a very low tolerance for thieves," Oscar said. The words were clipped, precise, and devoid of heat. Fred blinked, his confusion momentarily overriding his rage. "Thief? I ain't stolen nothing. I'm here for what's mine." "That is the theft," Oscar replied, stepping a fraction of an inch closer. The movement was predatory, a subtle shift that signaled the end of the conversation. "You believe that because she has no one, she is a commodity to be owned. You believe her silence is a vacuum you are allowed to fill with your noise. But in my city, we have a name for men who touch things that don't belong to them." The luxury watch on Oscar's wrist glinted as he adjusted his cuff, a casual gesture that felt more threatening than a drawn blade. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto Fred's. "They are called liabilities. And I am very efficient at liquidating liabilities." For the first time in 5 years, Amanda saw Fred flinch. The chaotic violence that had always been his greatest weapon was useless against the pressurized stillness of Oscar Buccho. Fred looked at the doors, then back at the man in the navy suit, realizing that he wasn't looking at a passenger, but at a wall of iron. Without another word, the bully recoiled, stepping back onto the dark platform as the pneumatic doors hissed shut, severing the connection between Amanda's past and her terrifying, silent present. The transition from the screeching subway to the silent interior of Oscar's black sedan was a descent into a world where even the air felt expensive. Amanda sat pressed against the leather, her brown handbag clutched to her chest like a shield, watching the blurred lights of Chicago through glass that she realized, with a shiver, was thick enough to stop a bullet. Beside her, Oscar remained a statue of navy wool and quiet intent, his presence a vacuum that Fred's lingering echoes could not penetrate. When they arrived, the fortress of iron rose before her, a monolith of glass and dark steel that pierced the low-hanging clouds of the city skyline. The elevator ride was a silent, vertical launch that left her stomach somewhere near the lobby. When the doors hissed open, Amanda didn't step into a home, she stepped into an empire. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of polished obsidian floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the glittering city into a private map spread out at Oscar's feet. There were no family photos, no cluttered shelves, no signs of the chaotic mess that had defined her life with Fred. Instead, there were monitors flickering with silent data, men in dark suits who moved with the synchronized grace of shadows, and an atmosphere of lethal, organized governance. Amanda stood on the edge of the vast living area, her pink sweater looking like a splash of blood against the monochrome perfection of the room. She realized then that she hadn't escaped into safety, she had been transplanted into a different kind of wild. Fred's house had been a cage of wood and drywall, built on the erratic whims of a small-time bully. This was a cathedral of power built on the absolute control of a king. Oscar walked to a sideboard, pouring a glass of water with a hand that didn't tremble. He looked at her, his unreadable eyes reflecting the city lights. "In that house, you were a ghost because he wanted to hide his crimes," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the high-altitude wind. "In this house, you will be a ghost because no one is allowed to see what I protect. Welcome to the center of the world, Amanda." The bathroom was a cathedral of white marble and heated stone, a stark contrast to the cramped, mildew-stained shower she had shared with Fred. On a sleek obsidian counter sat a stack of ivory silk and a basin of water that smelled of charcoal and rain. Amanda stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her fingers trembling as she reached for the hem of the pink sweater. For years, this wool had been her second skin, the fabric that soaked up her tears and muffled the sound of her heart whenever Fred's boots thudded down the hallway. As she pulled the sweater over her head, the sudden chill of the air felt like an awakening. She dropped the garment onto the marble floor. It looked small, pitiful and heavy with the weight of a 5-year war. Following it went the rest of her old life, a pile of frayed cloth that represented the woman Fred had tried to bury. Standing naked under the glow of the recessed lights, Amanda finally looked at herself without the filter of his voice. The bruises were there, angry blossoms of violet and yellow, and the thin, jagged tracks of his ring marked her skin. But as she began to wash, scrubbing away the grime of the Chicago tunnels and the lingering scent of Fred's cheap cologne, she saw something else. Beneath the discoloration, her muscles were taut. Her eyes, though shadowed by exhaustion, held a spark of something Fred had never managed to extinguish. He had called her a ghost, a hollow shell, a non-person. But ghosts didn't have pulses that thrummed with this much defiance. Ghosts didn't feel the sudden, searing heat of indignation rising in their chests. As she stepped into the silk garments Oscar had provided, the fabric gliding over her skin like a cool promise, she realized that Fred had made a tactical error. He had spent 5 years trying to break her, but he had only succeeded in stripping away everything that wasn't essential. What remained wasn't a victim. It was a survivor. The survival energy that had kept her breathing through the darkest nights of her marriage hadn't been extinguished, it had been compressed, turned into a hard, diamond-bright core of resilience. She caught her own gaze in the mirror and didn't look away. The girl in the pink sweater was gone, but the woman beneath it was finally starting to breathe. The training began not with a weapon, but with a chair. Oscar sat at the head of a massive mahogany table in the center of the penthouse, his navy suit sharp against the dark wood. He didn't look up as Amanda approached, her new ivory silks whispering against the obsidian floor. She moved as she always had, shoulders hunched, head tilted down, trying to displace as little air as possible. "Stop," Oscar said. The word wasn't loud, but it possessed the weight of a closing vault. Amanda froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at him with the wide, hypervigilant eyes that Fred had cultivated through 5 years of terror. "You are trying to apologize for existing," Oscar said, finally meeting her gaze. "Fred taught you that your life is a loan he can revoke at any time. He used noise to make you feel small. But true power is silent. It is the absolute certainty that you belong in the space you occupy." He stood and walked toward her, his movements possessing the fluid, terrifying grace of a predator that knew no equal. He stopped just inches away. Fred's power was a mask of glass, it was loud, and it was easily shattered. Your power must be a mask of iron. It is not about how much noise you make. It is about the stillness you maintain while the world screams around you. He placed a hand on the back of the chair and gestured for her to sit. When you walk into a room, do not look for the exit. Look at the people in it and realize they are guests in your world. You were an orphan, Amanda. You have no roots, which means no one can pull you up. You are the foundation. Amanda took a breath, letting it settle deep in her chest. She consciously lowered her shoulders, mimicking the pressurized stillness she saw in him. She sat in the chair, not perched on the edge like a bird ready to bolt, but leaning back, claiming the wood and leather as her own. "Better," Oscar murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his unreadable face. "The loudest man in the room is usually the most afraid. But the one who sits in the silence? That is the one who owns the city." The city lights below the penthouse windows looked like scattered diamonds on a bed of black velvet, but inside the glass, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, shared silence. Oscar stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the Chicago skyline. He didn't turn around when he spoke, his voice carrying that familiar, pressurized calm. "Fred told you that being an orphan made you a ghost," Oscar began, his hands clasped behind his back. "He wanted you to believe that a person is only as strong as the people standing behind them. It's a common lie told by small men who are afraid to stand alone." He finally turned, the low light catching the sharp angles of his face. For the first time, the most ruthless man in Chicago looked less like a king and more like a survivor. "My parents didn't leave me a name or a legacy, Amanda. They left me in a cold room with nothing but a floor that didn't belong to me. I spent years waiting for someone to build a foundation for me, waiting for a hand to reach down and pull me out of the zero." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "But no one came. And that was the greatest gift I was ever given." Amanda looked up from the mahogany table, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood. The orphan complex that Fred had used as a cage felt different in this light. "When you have nothing," Oscar continued, "you have no ceiling. When you have no one, you have no one to betray you. I had to become my own foundation, brick by bloody brick. I realized that a man who builds himself from zero can never be truly broken, because he knows exactly how to put the pieces back together." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the city he ruled. "Fred saw your isolation as a weakness he could exploit. I see it as a fortress. You are not a ghost, Amanda. You are a woman who has survived a war with nothing but your own will. That makes you more dangerous than any man who relies on a crowd to feel tall." In the quiet of the monolith, the lie Amanda had lived for 5 years finally began to crumble. She wasn't empty, she was a foundation waiting for an architect. For the first time, the word orphan didn't feel like a death sentence, it felt like a clean slate. Desperation had turned Fred's world into a jagged, narrowing tunnel. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cold, navy-clad wall that was Oscar Buccho, and every time he woke, he felt the stinging humiliation of being made small in his own city. He was no longer the king of a pink-sweatered ghost, he was a man losing his grip on everything. To Fred, if he couldn't own Amanda, he would ensure no one else could, even if it meant setting the city on fire. In a windowless basement on the south side, Fred sat across from men who smelled of gunpowder and old grudges, the Vane Syndicate, Oscar's longest-standing rivals. Fred's rugged face was slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he spread a series of stolen security codes and delivery schedules across a scarred wooden table. These were the keys to the Fortress of Iron, confidential data he had scavenged from a mid-level associate he'd cornered in a bar. "I know how to get inside," Fred hissed, his voice cracking with a frantic, toxic energy. "Buccho thinks he's untouchable because he's quiet. But he's distracted. He's got my wife up there. He's soft." The leader of the Vane crew, a man with eyes like flint, studied the blueprints. He didn't care about Fred's marriage or his wounded pride, he cared about the crack in the monolith. Fred was offering them the one thing Oscar's discipline usually made impossible, a way in. "If we do this," the man whispered, "Buccho dies. And the girl? She'll be collateral." "I don't care," Fred spat, the last vestige of his humanity dissolving into the shadows of the basement. "I want him to watch while I take back what's mine. I want him to see that he didn't save her, he just gave me a better cage to catch her in." As the syndicate began to arm themselves, checking the slides of their weapons and calibrating their comms, Fred felt a surge of the old, chaotic power. He was no longer the orphan's husband, he was the fuse. He didn't realize that in the world of men like Oscar Buccho, a fuse is only useful until the explosion begins. The fractured city was about to bleed, and Fred M. Keene was leading the blade straight to the heart of the sanctuary. The glass walls of the penthouse didn't shatter, they hummed with the impact of the Vane Syndicate's breach. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of cordite and the rhythmic, tactical thunder of suppressed gunfire. Amidst the chaos of the raid, Amanda didn't run. She didn't crouch in a corner or clutch her handbag like a shield. She stood in the center of the obsidian floor, draped in ivory silk, a pillar of pressurized stillness. When the heavy doors to the inner sanctum were kicked open, Fred burst through, his face a distorted mask of sweat and triumph. He was flanked by armed men, his rugged jacket torn, his eyes wild with the frantic need to see her break. He expected to find a ghost, he expected to find the woman in the pink sweater. "It's over, Amanda." Fred screamed, the sound grating against the elegant silence Oscar had taught her to cherish. "I told you. I told you the world would swallow you. Look at this place, it's a grave." Amanda didn't flinch. She watched him with the unreadable, cold-blooded composure of the man standing in the shadows behind her. She didn't see the monster who had owned her for 5 years, she saw a small, loud man drowning in his own noise. "You spent 5 years telling me I was nothing because I had no one," Amanda said. Her voice was low, precise, and carried further than his shout ever could. "But look around, Fred. I didn't need a family to build a foundation. I needed to realize that you were the only thing making me a ghost." Fred lunged forward, his hands reaching for her throat, but he stopped as if hitting a wall of ice. He looked into her eyes and saw not fear, but a lethal certainty. In that moment, the power shifted. The orphan complex died as Amanda occupied the space with absolute authority. Behind her, Oscar's shadows moved with surgical precision, disarming the Vane soldiers until Fred was left standing alone, a hollow shell in a cathedral of iron. "Take him away," Oscar commanded from the darkness. As Fred was dragged toward the elevator, sobbing that she was nothing, Amanda turned back to the city skyline. She was no longer a victim or an orphan. She was the architect of her own sanctuary, ruling the Chicago night beside the man who had shown her that zero is the strongest place to start.